Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we're privileged to be joined by Dr. Sharika D. Crawford, a distinguished historian of modern Latin America with a focus on Colombia and the circum-Caribbean. Dr. Crawford is an associate professor of history at the United States Naval Academy. Our discussion centers on her thought-provoking article, A Transnational World, Fractured but Not Forgotten, British West Indian, Migration to the Colombian islands of San Andres and Providence. This migration narrative of West Indians moving to neighboring islands and nations within the global South remains underexplored, despite its deep historical and cultural significance. So get comfortable and let's dive into this important and enlightening conversation.
I wanted to thank you so much, Professor Crawford, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to be able to discuss your paper that I happened to come across. And it was about the British West Indian migration to San Andres and Providence. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for having me on. So I am a professor, the Speedwell Professor of International Studies and a Professor of History at the U.S. Naval Academy based in Annapolis, Maryland. Really briefly, I am a historian of modern Latin America, as well as the circum-Caribbean, and in particular, these Colombian islands known today as San Andres, and in Spanish, Providencia, but Old Providence, as the islanders themselves refer to their location.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, and I really do appreciate that. And would you be able just to provide us an overview of the migration of British West Indians to these Colombian islands, San Andreas and Providence? What sparked that movement?
Absolutely. I'll refer to them as Providence, just to kind of make it easier for both of us.
Perfect.
So first of all, I probably should situate these islands for our listeners geographically, because so many people may not have heard of them. If you were looking at a map of the Caribbean Sea, and of course towards your right, you would see the larger islands, Cuba, you see Jamaica, you might see the island of Hispaniola. You would want to veer towards the left side of that map, towards Central America and really close to Nicaragua. And then you would probably just move about a little bit into the Caribbean Sea. You would see these two little tiny dots, and those two tiny dots are the islands first of San Andres, which is the largest and most populated of the two. And then there's Providence, and Providence is connected by a small bridge to Santa Catalina, but you'll hear me reference it as Providence. And these two islands are part of the Colombian territories. So the islanders who live on these two islands, both today and in the time period in which I trace migration from the late 1800s, but mostly into the early 1900s, also belong to Colombia. What essentially drew British West Indians to these two tiny islands is a story that is not often told, and it has two parts to that story. On the one hand, we have to think about the origins of San Andres and Providence. So it's an island that had been first colonized by English Puritans in the 17th century. The Spanish considered that part of the Americas their territory, drove them out. But then they're repopulated often by people who were seeking land and opportunity, either from larger islands in Jamaica, or sometimes the occasional pirate, whether they were French or Dutch or English, who showed up there. So this is a place where English is spoken. It's a place where people are deeply connected to other English-speaking places in the region. And then as they are encountering others either through their commercial trade, maritime trade, and hunting sea turtles, to exporting coconuts, or to sending their children to school in other parts of the English-speaking world, they encounter British West Indians. Sometimes they encounter them when they're in school in the United States. Some of them went to Tuskegee. Some of them went to have professional degrees, and perhaps on their way to maybe better opportunities where you have US corporations, whether because of the Canal Zone in the early 1900s, as the US takes that over after 1903, but 1904 really, or because of the United Fruit Company and the opportunities to work sometimes as a professional clerk, or even if they were working as a laborer on the banana plantations, sugar plantations, they often made their way or became familiar with these tiny islands that provided them in many ways an opportunity to pursue a profession with less competition. And so in my article, I talk about some of those particular stories of individuals who sort of found their way to these tiny islands, but keeping in mind that there's a longer connection between San Andres and Providencia and multiple nodes throughout the Caribbean, whether Jamaica, whether Belize, whether the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua or Costa Rica. And so that's sort of the dual sort of processes by which British West Indians become familiar with these really tiny islands.
No, thank you. And again, I know that we were talking before we started recording, it just goes to this whole migration that happens within the Caribbean itself. And, the next question is, why were these islands under Colombian jurisdiction and attractive destinations for West Indian migration?
So that's that's kind of the consistent question I often receive when talking about San Andres and Providence Islands. So first of all, they became a part of Colombian jurisdiction during the age of Spanish-American wars of independence for a period of time in the 1800s, in part because they were nominally a part of Spain. So they had English-speaking inhabitants who had surrendered their political authority to Spain in the 1700s to be permitted to stay on and to cultivate cotton, to have enslaved laborers, to formulate a life there. But that didn't really mean much, right? Spain is really far away. There's no real Spanish governor there. But that starts to change in the years of the early 1800s, the 18 teens to the 1820s. And they experience a number of sort of itinerant revolutionaries who show up on the ground, who occupy the place and subsequently facilitate their transfer to being a part of the newly established independent country of what will be called Colombia. So it's an odd story. It's part of these larger movements that were happening, but they're not being led by the local people themselves. It's being forced upon them, or external factors created that kind of condition. Now, why would British West Indian migrants perhaps find these islands attractive? Well, in the early part of the 1900s, San Andres in particular was, we might consider it a sort of relatively stable and well-off but small community. We're talking about a little under 2,000 inhabitants. Much of their prosperity, and there was some prosperity there, was driven by their ability to produce coconuts on the world market. We think so much of the Caribbean is shaped and dominated first by sugar. Mm-hmm. And then subsequently in certain parts, bananas. Mm-hmm. And then in different parts, you might hear about cacao, right? You might hear about these sort of tertiary sort of commodities. But for this island, it was coconuts. And it was coconuts since the end of abolition in the middle of the 1850s. for most people on that island, and it was largely a trade that was carried on by people who were the descendants of had been formerly enslaved. And so, if you were someone from Trinidad, for existence, you might have met a San Andres Islander when you were at school at Tuskegee or Meharry at medical school. And when you're thinking about going back and starting up a medical practice, as was the case with one of the gentlemen that I feature, this is an opportunity for you to establish a medical practice without a lot of competition, because the island has a fairly prosperous population, but it doesn't have the same sort of infrastructure developed there. So people wanted a nice, quiet life with people who had the means to pay. And so you start to see some of these individuals show up there. We do have other types of migrants who come from Jamaica, and they come there because of their business interest. I document in this article using shipping records and newspapers, sort of the back and forth between passengers coming, sometimes from Kingston, or they're going to Bluefields, Nicaragua, and they're passing through Providence and San Andres. And part of that has to do with the commercial maritime trade that was happening. San Andres is kind of like a stopping point. And so therefore, people become familiar with the islands, and there are opportunities. Maybe I can open a shop, an import shop, right, where I'm bringing goods from Jamaica, which are probably coming from Britain or larger countries in the global north. So you have a few individuals who I highlight who had those particular stories. And then finally, perhaps something unknown or less known, maybe to even your ardent listeners who are very familiar with the Caribbean. San Andres and particularly Providence had been a part of a very robust economy in turtles, sea turtle hunting. The people who were hunting sea turtles often came from Providence, and those who were bringing them in or participating in sort of commercial transactions often stopped at the port in San Andres. So sometimes they end up, engaged in marriages with one another, or, consensual, family relationships. And so this turtle trade, where you're simply seeing individuals from the Cayman Islands or Providence or off the coast of Nicaragua hunting sea turtles, put them in greater contact with these tiny little islands and the little islets and keys around them. And so those individuals and part of the kind of maritime work found themselves repeatedly staying for lengthy periods of time on the island, establishing families on the island, and or coming to retire and live there permanently. So you have sort of these three distinct groups: professionals, merchants or traders, and even those in the maritime trade, and particularly turtle fishing.
No, thank you. And, I just wanted to touch upon you mentioned the commercial aspect of it. So with the United Fruit Company, how did they influence or facilitate the wave of migration?
So that's a great question. So to be clear for our listeners, the United Fruit Company is not one of the kind of multinational companies that we know about that was everywhere, literally everywhere in the Caribbean and Central and South America. They were not on San Andres. So what we have on the island of San Andres in particular, and then in Providence, I'll share the other sort of important commercial kind of product commodity. On San Andres, because of the coconuts, essentially you have one business. It's called the Franklin Baker Company. It was based in the United States and in New Jersey, and they are bringing ships to come to, bring and purchase coconuts directly. But the United Fruit Company, this was not a large enough location for them to extend themselves. I think that what we should kind of consider about the United Fruit Company and its influence and maybe the mobility of these individuals should be that Caribbean people started to bump into other people and learn about other places because people were moving very frequently. Let me give you an example. It's not, as I mentioned, it was very common for passengers who may be coming from Kingston, Jamaica, who would really want to go to Limon, Costa Rica, but they may have on that ship the captain may stop at San Andres. San Andres is not their destination, but they might stop off. They might meet a nice lady. They might meet a good friend, right? They'll give their shot at the United Fruit Company, which takes in lots of workers, but a lot of workers don't stay on. They are constantly moving, looking for better opportunities. And very small numbers of those individuals would end up in a place like San Andres, maybe permanently, maybe just, transitory, like moving on to the next best thing. So the United Fruit Company is not based in San Andres. It's not based in Providence, which also cultivates oranges. But being that it's such an important recruiter, right, a magnet by which individuals are seeking opportunities, it creates the dynamism that allows people to perhaps engage or learn of San Andres who wouldn't if they came from the Eastern Caribbean, which is so far away. And I mean, like the Lesser Antilles, it would just be a very, distant sort of encounter for them between these two places.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. And then I just wanted to touch upon in terms of, with West Indians mostly primarily being English and of course Creole being spoken, was Spanish ever an issue? Like, how did these migrants, face in terms of being able to assimilate either linguistically or culturally on the island? How did that work?
Fortunately for them, prior to 1950, if they arrived prior to 1950, and in my article, I focus mostly on those who arrived before 1940, they had an easy time, in part for the reasons that I stated earlier regarding this sort of unusual positionality of these islands. So they're about 200 miles from the nearest port in the country of Colombia, which would be Cartagena. So they're really far away, right? So there's the governing of the place is very, very loose. There's not a lot of government officials who live on the island. There might be 3 or 4 at any given time who are coming from the mainland. So the people have sort of retained this sort of Anglophone, Protestant, Caribbean culture that they've had since at least the 1700s. So you go to the primary mother church on the island is First Baptist Church. Subsequently, there will be an Adventist church in the early 1900s, and the Catholics will arrive, English-speaking Catholics, U.S., based Adventists, Baptists who have been there for a few generations and who have connections to Jamaica. So if you came from Trinidad, if you came from a smaller island like the Dutch islands, there's some people who come from St. Eustatius who speak English. You're going to integrate in an Anglophone community. And so prior to 1950, it's actually quite easy because Spanish is not the language of day-to-day interactions. There's very, very few, to use a term to help situate the population. There's not Hispanic population in large numbers who live in San Andres or Providencia, although the people themselves are jurisdictionally under Colombia, and therefore they are Colombian nationals, but not of the same culture of the mainland people.
Okay, perfect. No, that was great distinction to be made. And I know that you mentioned in terms of some of the sources, but what types of sources or archives were used mostly in tracing this migration patterns, whether it was letters or oral histories, and of course, shipping records?
Yeah. So as you can imagine, it's very challenging for historians to tell the history of people afoot, people who are moving, right? They're moving from place to place. You might see them appear in one place and then you try to figure out where they go. I had a couple of wonderful resources that helped me, and it's important to keep in mind that I had a very small place, right? I'm looking at a very, very tiny place. I mentioned at the start of our discussion, there's no more than 2,500, maybe 3,000 in the 1920s and 30s that live on the island. So a very tiny population to pay attention to. So I was able to use the following types of sources. The first newspaper that was formed on this island, it was established in about 1912. It was called the Searchlight, and it was produced in English and in Spanish, and it only lasted about 2 years. But one of the things that they did in that newspaper is essentially they would print in every issue like notices, and they would essentially tell you like who's coming to the island, which ship arrived, and like what places did they dock at or where people were leaving. And they would sometimes say, oh, we have to say goodbye to Miss Jane, who's leaving to X place. So I paid attention to the locations and the people who were moving. I then replicated that with a couple other newspapers. Your listeners probably are familiar with the Daily Gleaner or the Gleaner, depending on the time period. It's digitized. One of my mentors, she's a professor at Pitt, who's also a historian of the Caribbean, Laura Putnam, once said, it's like, an excuse, I hope it's not too vulgar, it's like crack for a historian because you type in something and then you get all the metadata and it highlights for you, so you just can be on it for a long period of time. So I was able to access the digitized Jamaican newspaper. There are also a few English-based newspapers that appear in these communities where you had the United Fruit Company or you had these Anglophone communities in Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And some of them are accessible in person or online. So in Costa Rica, the National Library of Costa Rica has a lot of these digitized. So I went through those. At the New York Public Library, and for Bluefields, Nicaragua, I looked at those as well. The shipping records came to me because the tiny islands of San Andres and Providencia had been governed under the Ministry of Government. And in Bogota, at the National Archive, the Ministry of Government records are pretty complete in the time period in which I was studying. And there's a lot of correspondence. And so part of the correspondence would be like, it's actually month to month, kind of frequent correspondence, but it may include annual sort of reports from the local official writing to the Minister of Government about things that are happening. Shipping is part of it. They also have the national sort of register. It's called the right now I'm slipping the kind of technical name, but it's the National Register. And so it's published very, very regularly. And they include laws and decrees, but they also include any transactions with commerce in terms of coconut exports or imports, taxes, and shipping records. So I had port to port kinds of things. And then finally, what I would also draw attention to are travel document or travel accounts. I mentioned earlier the story of these islands in terms of the Caribbean is one that is their origin story, that they've long been a part of the Caribbean. And so I was able to look at published like 1700s, early 1800 travel accounts that are actually just about the region. It's usually about like a sea captain who's, doing business in this region and they stop in San Andres. And so I would read those travel accounts very, very carefully to get a sense of how to place these islands vis-a-vis the other locations in the Caribbean to flesh out the story.
Yes, no, and what you mentioned before in terms of, looking at the digital records, especially for when it comes to newspapers, yes, absolutely very addictive. And you can spend days, if not, weeks, being looking addicted. So with that being said, were there any challenges in, of course, documenting this relatively understudied aspect of Caribbean migration history?
Yeah, and let me just mention one other important record because I just want to, just in case my listeners would like to do something similar. I mentioned that the small islands of San Andres and Providence have like a mother church. The most important religious institution is the First Baptist Church, which was founded in the 1840s. And they have a pretty good register, sort of records of baptismal records of church membership and marriages. So, and it's now digitized, or not digitized, it's on microfilm at that time. And so I was able to look at marriage records, and it was really important because at the time, the pastor of Brockhost Livingston at the time, essentially, he was really concerned. He wanted his people to be very pious, and he wanted them to, have, marital partners without any, extra relationships. And he was highly concerned about some of his local members marrying outsiders because sometimes they would be maybe already married to individuals. And so there's a lot of attention in the records about having testimonies, witnesses who could attest that this gentleman who's from Bocas del Toro or from Cayman Islands doesn't have any known marriages, and so I could kind of trace where people were from also through this, set of religious records. So I just wanted to add that was a kind of an interesting source. It wasn't as the duration of the years in which I could see this across time wasn't as long, but in the early 1900s and 1910s, this was an issue of concern for that particular community. And so that was a source. Now, you have a great question about kind of what was the challenges. The challenges weren't the sources because I kind of could tell a sort of case study, a micro study, if you will. I think the limitations or the challenges for me was trying to convince others that this was a story worth telling. In graduate school, and I'll age myself. I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, so this is a long time ago. Um, when we thought about Caribbean migration, it was in two ways. It was Caribbean migration going to the north, particularly because I'm in the US, so we were looking at Caribbean migration to the United States. But of course, to England would be another site of importance. Or we were looking at Caribbean migration because I was a Latin Americanist through the United Fruit Company, going to places or the canal zone. So going anywhere from Guatemala, Honduras, or Costa Rica, or these Panama, these kinds of places. And if you didn't have the role of a multinational company facilitating or driving migration, they didn't think it was important because the people that I'm studying are doing it on their own. It's not organized by any government. It's not organized by a big company and we need tens of thousands of workers. It is simply individuals making the choice. And what I would say is that I'm not sure at the time in my piece if I was able to articulate it, but I would say years later, 14, 15 years later, that what I was a part of was a larger discussion of saying we don't know the full story about Caribbean mobility because largely Caribbean mobility is individuals literally going within the region. They're moving from other places nearby. And because we're so fixated, or maybe because of the nature of the kind of records we can access, like the United Fruit Company records or the Isthmian Canal, records, that it's dominated like who we focus on and who matters in terms of Caribbean migration. And so this was just, in many ways, perhaps a small, little tiny component of what I think many more scholars are doing and people are recognizing in terms of telling this history.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, Professor Crawford, because, I just recently just came back from Jamaica and looking at documentation to see that people moved all over. This wasn't that the Caribbean was siloed to each island, that there was frequent and fluid movement throughout the time of its existence. So the other question I wanted to ask you is in reference to the article's title. You said that it's fractured but not forgotten, which I think is really important. Would you be able to speak to how this, transnational identity persists among descendants of migrants today?
Yeah, so in two ways, I should explain to our listeners that the migration of people coming from the English-speaking Caribbean in particular to these islands starts to come to an end around the 1930s, definitely 40s into the 50s. You see much, fewer numbers, and for reasons that may or may not be known to the listeners, in part that in the 1930s, around the Americas, we start to get a regime, sort of international control system of passports and visas. You have by 1920s, you have the Johnson-Reed Act in the United States that has a quota system. And so Colombia in particular, but other countries in Central America that had received these Caribbean populations as laborers start to have really restrictive policies. So you start to see kind of an opportunity of closing. That being said, when I was, initially a researcher on the island, so I first came to these islands in 2001. I was a Fulbright scholar, so I lived on the island for the first 6 months and then started graduate school the following next academic year and came back every summer and lived there for many longer periods of time. The people themselves were highly attuned and aware of this rich sort of mosaic of their positionality and their connections to the wider Caribbean. They speak fondly. I say they speak in present. They still speak very fondly of their ancestors who may have came from the Bay Islands or the Cayman Islands, or Jamaica is very, very centered in their understanding of themselves and relationship to who they are vis-a-vis other places. And so the fractured part was the explaining about why the migration sort of was coming to an end by the 30s and 40s and 50s, but the fact that they still remembered it. So in the I would say starting in the 1980s and 90s, in 2000s, you saw opportunities for people from San Andres to travel to the English-speaking Caribbean. Some of them went to trying to find work in the Cayman Islands. They had a high-level diplomat who was given the kind of Colombian ambassadorship of the Caribbean. So to CARICOM, like after CARICOM was formed, and they've even had some high-level profiled individuals go to Jamaica and lecture and sort of speak of these relationships. So I was really trying to make it known that maybe in Jamaica people may have not have heard of San Andres and Providencia, but the people on the island certainly know of Jamaica and they feel a closeness in a way that sort of speaks to their ancestral roots. I wouldn't say they're going to identify down to the parish that you may have came from in Jamaica, but they're very interested in genealogy, right? So they want, for example, they want to know Livingston is a family name and it came from a family that had roots in Jamaica, right? They want to know about the Archbolds, and so they're very much trying to situate themselves among other people whom they see a part of their larger family. So that was what I was trying to connote, despite the fact that we live where there's different borders and people can't necessarily get on a flight and easily get to these places, that people haven't forgotten.
No, perfect. Yes, and it always stays with them. And that's what I can kind of allude to. But again, I know that you didn't mention previously that with Colombia, that the fact that these islands are nationalities of Colombia, were there any laws or national policies that really impacted the rights, like land ownership and recognition on the island itself?
So you may recall just a moment ago, I said that migration started to come to a closure in the 1930s and 40s. And I said really by 1950s and above. Well, the 50s is the pivotal transformational change on the island. In 1953, for the first time, at the time, their military general, who was a dictator in Colombia, a man named Rojas Pinilla, he arrives there. He's the first time a president has ever arrived to the islands, and he gets there by new technology, aviation. And what he starts is a very fundamental transformation in their economy and their society and their culture. He introduces, in a way to respond to the concerns that he heard from people on the island, at least the elite population's concerns. He creates a free port, and the free port subsequently creates an opportunity for tourism. So the island becomes quickly an island that used to produce coconuts, where the coconut economy had kind of faltered in the 1930s through the Great Depression and other reasons, to turning into mass tourism. And with mass tourism, it's not the same where they're bringing people from England, the US, Canada, or somewhere to these islands. It's people from mainland Colombia who are bringing capital and creating hotels and then restaurants, and they need workers. And the workers they choose are not the local people who are from the island, because why? They speak different languages. They haven't been working in the same capacity of carpentry and buildings. They end up driving an internal migration from the Caribbean coast in Colombia. So you start seeing people anywhere from Medellin, which is in the interior, to Cartagena and Barranquilla. And then this island that had 3,000, 2,000 people, 10,000 in 3 years, then 15,000, then 20,000. And then the island population becomes basically increasingly a minority voice. And you start to see a lot of cultural conflict, not in a volatile sense in terms of physical aggression, but this sense that they have to preserve who they are. And so this has been the ongoing struggle, and it's because of this economic and then subsequently administrative changes that will come out of it. Because of that, the islands is a very popular tourist destination for Colombians and maybe those who live in the immediate surrounding areas, but it's not a place that they invite people, particularly from the English speaking Caribbean, to come there, which would then reinforce the distinction between the local island people and those who are new migrant arrivals from the mainland internally. And so those changes are are kind of what are that's what they face. It's an existential crisis. So it's tourism again. Like we're still telling the story of tourism in the Caribbean, but it played out in a way that is different from what we've seen in other parts of the region, but equally very, impactful. And so that they feel like they're a minority in their own island, and that they don't have the ability to preserve culture, to preserve land, because land has become so important in terms of its viability to tourism. And so they've worked to try to preserve it, and they do have protections since 1994. They do have certain protections, but the protections still don't override concerns about unemployment, cultural preservation, and their inability to access easily the ability to connect with other parts of the Caribbean that they feel are part of their larger ancestry.
Yeah, that is, a really good point, and a really good indication as to, I guess, how change comes about. And when change comes about as drastic as that was, that people really want to tie in to their cultural, to their heritage, to who they are. And so, with that being said, you know, in general, like what does migration really tell us about, Caribbean labor mobility, and of course the creation of diasporic spaces beyond North America and Europe?
Mm. So I think a few things. At least when I was in graduate school and I was trying to understand, the migration I saw on this island in this time period in the early 20th century, I would say that the material, the books and the articles I was reading gave me a very strong impression that when Caribbean migrants moved, particularly to places in the global north or even in Central America, it was always faced with restrictions, um, or discriminatory policies because of color or nationality. And in fact, I don't actually know if that's fully true.
Mm-hmm.
I think that happened in those locations in those time periods. And I actually think Caribbean people, because of their history of moving a lot, moving first internally and then externally, they're very adept of knowing how to create adaptive strategies. But I think that we might want to pause a moment because I don't know if we have the full story of the Caribbean mobility experience. And I think we've taken a couple of key examples and we've kind of raised them to the heights of being like the standard. And I suspect that for most Caribbean people, they were able to adapt and be able to integrate and find a life for themselves of meaning and sometimes actually quite successful prosperity, as was the case of some of the individuals highlighted in my article. And so I would say that I would caution us that the Caribbean mobility story one is not fully complete.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be complete until we have a better sense of what it looked like to move to islands nearby and how that process went. For example, in Providence Island, because of the turtle fishing, you have a number of people who are Canadian, have ties to the Cayman Islands, as we saw in the case of Bay Islands. And they're integrated. You and I would not know how to distinguish them. Maybe the local people who've been there a long time would know that, but they're a part of that story. And I think we have this sense that somehow diasporic communities are formed because of some type of opposition of the host country. And I'm not saying that it hadn't happened because it has,
Mm-hmm.
but I wonder if we looked at more cases, maybe we would be able to have a more nuanced account of that. So that would be sort of kind of a big takeaway. And that too, finally, that diasporic communities are really resilient. And people were constantly grappling with multiple types of societies and immigration policies, and they were interested in seeking the best kind of outcome for themselves and their family members, and that you might be surprised that they are moving to places that you and I today wouldn't seem like maybe that's not a desirable place. But I think that if we look at more cases, we're going to see actually that they're there. They're part of these very robust transnational communities that are not just in the UK, that is not in just the United States or in Panama or Costa Rica. And so I hope this encourages others to kind of move beyond, 3 or 4, key sites.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more there with that being said. And this then just goes to my next question, which is, why is it important to recover and teach these lesser known stories of Caribbean migration?
Mhm. Well, I think the Caribbean is a wonderful kind of example of modernity, mobility in the kind of basic sense. We are in an age of constant mobility, constant migration, and we're seeing policies being created to address the rise in what we would kind of discuss as migration. And I think the Caribbean has a very long history of that. We have a very long history, examples of people who had to make choices about departing from their home, from their community, from their family, from short or long durations, and then being permitted, accepted, allowed, adopting, opposing, creating conditions in which they could thrive. And I think that if we paid a little bit more attention to the Caribbean, it might give us some insights as to how we can do this in a way that allows all these people to really thrive and to have an opportunity to make a life for themselves and their families. And I'm talking from the United States point of view right now in a heightened period in which there's an exclusionary mechanism towards migration. It's not the only country, but it's become extremely rigid and unhinged in many ways. And I do think that there's an opportunity for those of us who would like to see how we might be able to do this better. The Caribbean might offer some answers. The story of Caribbean migration could offer some answers of how to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And, Professor Crawford, as we come to a close to this discussion, what lessons can modern Caribbean people, especially those in the diaspora, take from this history of adaptation, resistance, and cultural endurance?
One, I've been so, I think it was your question about the fractured but not forgotten component of the title. One that, regardless if you are able to stay in the place of your birth or where you were reared, it does not disconnect you completely from your people, from your history, from your culture. I myself am a person who is of no known connections to the Caribbean. My spouse is from West Africa, from Ghana. And I've been really quite amazed to see when people are disconnected physically from their space, how they recreate it, in the home, right? The stories we tell, the food we cook, the dishes, right? The ways that we may seek out community or create community when new arrivals come, whether in a church, in a civic way. This has been the story of the Caribbean. Every place that people from the Caribbean have departed and entered into, they've been able to kind of figure out how to make that space work for them. And so I would encourage, if people don't already know this about themselves, they should absolutely know that I think Caribbean people are the most adaptive and creative and resilient. People that I've had the encounter to meet and to know and to study and to learn from. And so I think this could be sort of a model, and it should be a source of strength particularly when we're facing, depending on where they are in the United Kingdom, or if they're in the United States or wherever, moments that are very, very challenging in terms of international control systems mobility.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate your time for coming on, Professor Crawford, and to be able to discuss this because, as we were talking before we started recording, my recent trip to Jamaica had me uncover a lot of connections to other islands connecting back into Jamaica, which was beyond my wildest dreams. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and discussing your article. Thank you.
No, thank you, Wendy. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.